would you like to swing on a star?
I'm sat here today with my grandfather, Bill Morvan, and I'd just like to chat with him about his time living through the German occupation of Jersey. Can you please remind us what year you were born?
I was born in 1930, and just out of interest, that was just after the start of the last big recession. Cut that if you wanted to know.
That's all right, Pa. And what years of the occupation did you live through?
I lived through 1940 until 1945.
1945. Okay, well I've got a few questions here about the occupation. Your parents were given the option of evacuation by the British government. Did your family ever consider evacuating, and what made them decide to stay?
You ask a very interesting question there, actually, because my grandparents were still alive. My grandfather was a farmer, and so he didn't intend to go anywhere because animals and things like that in his farm, he didn't want anyone else messing around with it. My dad was a grocer, and he didn't want to leave his business either because he'd only just bought the thing, just very few months actually before the start of the occupation. And so he didn't want to do it, so a family powwow that I had very little to do with decided that my grandmother and my mother and I were going to evacuate. And we were in this enormous queue of people. It seemed to stretch on forever and ever. Nothing seemed to move very much, and eventually my mum, being my mum, started crying, and my grandmother says, "That's it, we're going home." And so that's how we ended up in 5 years of occupation.
Wow, and did any of your friends get evacuated? Do you remember your friends leaving?
Yes, definitely. It was a mixture, you know. It was one of those silly things that 1 minute there was a whole pile of people you knew, and the next minute there was hardly anybody by comparison. But it was the same with just a few days before the occupation started. If you rode on our bikes, as it was in those days, past any one of the slips looking out to sea, you'd see a machine gun post with sand-filled bags all the way around it, and a couple of Tommies, you know, all pointing out to sea with this thing. And suddenly, and there was a whole pile of military people over here. I mean, I can remember the Fleet Air Arm, where you can see the hotel just down there, the Somerville Hotel, and they were there for quite a few months, and they were practicing at Jersey Airport before the war. And remember that they were the sort of people who would land on aircraft carriers, amongst other things. And anyway, this particular day, they were all there, and there was stacks of military, really. The next day, bingo, they were all gone. And within 3 days, they were replaced by the Germans.
Wow. And on the 28th of June 1940, St Helier and St Peter Port harbours were bombed by the German troops. Do you remember this day, and where were you at the time?
My father was a grocer, and he was the grocer at Belroyal, which is a place facing south.
Okay.
And at that time, we were still living at St Oban, and so we got around on bikes more than anything else, and we cycled as far as Bowmore and went into, there was a gent's hairdresser there, and we went in for a haircut, and we were waiting our turn. I remember my father was in the chair, and all of a sudden there was a heck of a commotion, and we all rushed outside. We could see these planes all around, and that's when the bombs got dropped. My father had half a haircut, and he had to push off because he was in the auxiliary fire service. And as soon as that happened, obviously he was going to be on call, and for that he needed to be at St Albans. So we cycled to St Albans as far as we could, and just behind where we lived at the beginning of the hill, there was a tunnel, a railway tunnel, and that was just being turned, they hadn't finished yet, into an air raid shelter. But I remember that I think most of the bombs had been dropped by then, because they dropped at La Roque, which is southeast corner of the island, and down at the Weybridge, and a bomb dropped down at the beginning of Melcaster Street, if I remember.
And were people killed?
People were killed, yes.
How many, do you remember?
No, I'm going to be 82 now. I can't quite remember. I know there were several killed for sure. Yes, but I can't remember quite how.
And did that mark the start of the
That
occupation?
was within
Yeah.
I should say within a day. They'd landed in aeroplanes up at the airport, and that was the start of the occupation. But by then I was living in our house, which was at the start of Morlaix, which goes up the hill going towards St Blanche Bay, and there was a bit of noise outside. My parents and I rushed to the window, and I'll never forget there was some German people on motorbikes hurtling down the hill, followed by several cars, all with Germans in them, and that was the start, effectively.
Wow. And when you first saw the Germans, were you terrified of them? How did you react to seeing them in the flesh?
No, we just tended to look at them and they looked back at us, really. Though in very few days they put in official notices in the Evening Post and had them stuck everywhere all around the place that you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that and you couldn't do anything else. But that was the start of it all.
And talking about rules, I know the Germans, there are lots of rules that they kind of put in place, such as they didn't allow islanders to listen to wireless radio.
No, they very rapidly hauled those in. I can't remember exactly when they hauled them in, but all I can say to you about radios, there were rather a lot of people who hung on to them. But on the other hand, if you were caught with one, the next thing you'd find is you'd be before military court over here, you'd find yourself sentenced to at least 6 months in a French prison, but it wasn't very long. You were never in the French prison very long. Rapidly they got hold of you and you found yourself in the group of concentration camps, effectively, probably in Germany or Poland or somewhere. And I suppose most of the people that we lost by German action were people who sort of got moved into those sort of camps, concentration camps, and probably worked beyond their capability, and you know, you had a fair number of people who died. Very few people seem to come back from the concentration camps. If you were moved from the French prison that you were sent to in the first place, and a lot of people were, then you could say you were on, well, a big chance you were on your way.
And you were very aware of everything that was going on with the concentration camps, or
no,
you didn't
all
you
came
didn't
to
know at
light
the time?
really after.
After, yeah.
I know one thing I didn't know was that I don't know, something was done by the Brits, and I can't remember exactly what it was, that upset Hitler personally, so we were told. And the next thing was there was an order brought out in the Channel Islands which said if your parents were English or not born in Jersey, even though you might have Jersey children, you were likely to be taken off to France. Can you see that?
A plane in the sky.
It's going slowly, isn't it?
And did you ever break rules, the German rules? Did you ever break the nighttime curfew, or did you ever listen to wireless radio against their wishes?
I broke a few of their rules because more or less anybody broke their rules eventually, sometimes because you didn't want to. But me personally, when the thing that I learned from my father, he got called to the fire service, and the headquarters of that at that time, the one he was in, it was an auxiliary station, was at St Albans, and we lived by then close next door to his grocer's shop at Balmoral, and it was the day of D-Day, so into February the 6th, 1944, and my father got called, and he got on his bike, he's on his way up here. When he got to that sort of thing there where you can go that way, that way, that way, or that way. Effectively, you could go 4 directions. It was there was a gang of Germans, and they had a gun, and they knew that D-Day was on its way, and they got very excited and nervous about this. And my father said when he got home eventually, he said the funny thing was, they were constantly changing the direction this gun was pointing in. You know, they seemed to think that imminently some Tommies or Allied troops were going to land down here. very shortly after that, the Germans decided that this was an ideal place to have a landing, and so they got a lot of poles, big sort of poles like that, and they sharpened the end so that it was like that, and they put them into the sand all around this bay at the low water mark, and they had a mine on the top. Now, me being observant about things like that, purely on the grounds that by then we were running very short of gas and electricity and anything like that, so it was a case of being able to cook your meals. There weren't many big meals, but you'd have to have one a day. It might be only potatoes. But and then it got to the point that sometimes we got so desperate that you'd eat mangels, which is basically animal food, and Swedes, and I could never stand parsnips even in those days. It's just one of those things. As hungry as I got, I never really got to eating parsnips or anything like that. But anyway, I found that just along by the Coronation Park, the Germans had built an Organisation Todt. They're the people who made all the walls that were around the place, the concrete walls and concrete fortifications and bunkers and so forth. They were busy knocking the ends off to sharpen up these poles that they were hammering into the sand with the mine on the top. And I'd spotted them going past, so I and two other young friends, they were both younger than me because I was 14 at the time, and one of them was 10, one of them was 7. And we'd got in by going into the public park, crawled in under the barbed wire with a sack each. There was no one around because it wasn't their main base. It was a base that the Organisation Todt worked in, and their main base with this part of the island was sort of about a mile further down the Victoria Avenue, where now a whole pile of houses have been built on since then. It used to be called the Circus Field because once a year before the war there was a circus performed. A proper circus used to come over to Jersey, and they'd perform there because there was nothing on it, you see. And so it was the headquarters for all the western part of the Organisation Todt. Anyway, so we got this wood and we got away with it, and it was so easy that, like fools, we decided we'd go the next night because wood was invaluable to burn.
Is this to keep your family warm?
It was not so much for that, it was for cooking.
For cooking, okay.
You see, potatoes are not so nice eaten raw.
So would you cook them in the garden? Would you burn the wood in the garden?
No, all houses had a sort of a fireplace, and you do it on top of that.
Okay.
So we thought we'd go the second night, and that was the big rock upon which we perished, because there's the three of us crept in under the barbed wire again, started filling our sacks, and the sacks were about a third full, and an Organisation Todt bloke stepped out from behind another pile of wood with a levelled rifle, and he just took us up Victoria Avenue with a gun at our backs, effectively, up to his headquarters. And I was a bit scared because all the shouting was going in my direction because I was the biggest, you see. I was 14, and somebody came cycling past. Remember that in those days the number of cars on the road and nothing was practically the same. There was some Organisation Todt lorries, usually Opel Blitz as they used to call them, or that was the make on the front of them. And this fellow came cycling along ever so slowly, and he was looking at us, but it was a bit strange to see three youngsters like this with a fellow behind with a level rifle at their backs, you know. Anyway, this chap came quite close to me, and he was somebody who knew my father very well, and he said, I said to him very quietly as he went past, "You wouldn't mind telling Dad, would you?" That's all I said. And my dad obviously got hold of the parents of the other two as well, and because we were kept in this flipping place and being told off most of the time for quite a little while, actually. By the time my parents ran us down, remember all this started at about 7 o'clock, and by the time they got to where we were being held, I suppose it was about I would think about 9:15 at night. And I was wondering if they were going to let us go at 10 o'clock because that was the time for the curfew.
And were you terrified when you had a gun pointed in your back? Was it very frightening experience, or did you
well,
think?
it wasn't nice because I was young and I was very small in those days. When the war finished, for example, I'm 6'1" now in socks, or I was, when I got to my tallest. But at that time I was only this height at the end of the war. And that was just shortage of food, I suppose.
Mm.
And the other time that I could have got into serious trouble, but I didn't, it was a bit later than that. They'd got, I think it was 4 Renault tanks. Do you know where was a bus, a little railway station at Millbrook? It's now a cafe.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, just outside there, towards the end of the war, there was either 4 or 5 Renault tanks in there, and I was desperately trying to build. I built a crystal radio, but what I wouldn't even made the crystal up. There was an old fellow, Catholic priest at St Albans, who'd found out how to make these crystals, and he'd shown me how to do it, and I tried it. You'd use sulphur and coke, I think, and. But the only thing that I didn't have, because by then every single telephone box all around the island, you'd sign the telephone box and the telephone would be there, but there'd be no handset. Because you see, with a handset you could use it as a earphone to pick up on these crystal sets. Mm. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to try and find one from somewhere else. So I one day took a tremendous chance and climbed into one of these tanks, and there was a pair of things, and if you want to wait a minute, I've still got them in my bedroom or in there. Wow. They're beginning to look a bit old and nasty now, but would you like to see them?
Yes,
actual things I pinched out of the tank.
We'll get them at the end of the interview. That would be great.
Remind me.
It sounds like you were quite adventurous and quite.
There were people who were far more adventurous than me. For example, somebody who I was a member of the local government with many years later. Actually, he was the only chap who ever officially became a communist and got elected into the States. He was a very reasonable sort of bloke, and one of the things he was trying to do, but he was older than I, by quite a bit actually, he tried very hard to get the ordinary troops, German troops, to mutiny against their officers. And this was towards the end of the war, and he did admit to me one day, he says, you know, Bill, it was very frightening. You'd be stealing into where the German soldiers of that area were sleeping, but when you sort of gave your little tap on the door to be let in so that you could talk to them about this, you didn't know if there was a sort of a gang inside ready to shoot you as you came through the door. Wow. Because they knew what you were trying to do. You were trying to get them to mutiny against their own officers, you know. Yeah. It didn't work, by the way. They didn't mutiny and they didn't report.
Yeah.
You know, so this fellow is still alive. No, he's not still alive. He died a few years ago. Poor chap, but there you go.
Okay, and how did the occupation affect your school life?
Badly.
Did you still go to school?
I did.
And what happened there?
Well, I won a scholarship to the local grammar school, but the problem was, and it's worth noting this, it ruined a lot of people's education. I mean, all of you nowadays, you go to university, I mean, it's the common thing, though I've got a feeling with this recession on, perhaps less people will go to university. But at that time, all the sort of fine line sort of examinations, like, say, a school leaving, what do they call it? Your school leaving certificate, or matriculation, which was the next one up. Okay. All those exams and plenty of others used to come from England regularly. Well, being occupied, there was no way we could get those things.
The papers to the
we just didn't
papers.
get the papers. So effectively, win a scholarship or not, I felt that my education was largely shot, you know. And having gone through 5 years of this sort of stuff under the war, I just couldn't think to myself, I'll have to find another 3 years to go back to school. Just didn't feel like doing it.
Because what age were you during the occupation?
I was 10 when it started and 15 and a half when it finished.
Okay. And did many people after the occupation get their certificates?
No. A lot of people who'd come out, I came out at the wrong time effectively. Supposing I'd have been 2 years younger, by the time the liberation would have taken place, I would have been 13. So it wouldn't have been too bad to stay till you were, say, 16, 17 to get these things.
Yeah.
But it was just difficult. So I actually was offered a job in the head office of Voisin and Company, and I've always said that I got my degree on business training in that head office of Voisin and Co. And it taught me a lot about business, actually. So it served me well when I married your grandmother and subsequently got a hotel business going together.
And did you ever encounter slavery during the occupation?
Yes.
Do you remember seeing sites of slavery?
Yes, I did. This is why I personally, you would meet some German soldiers who frankly didn't want to be here any more than we wanted them to be here, you know. And if you would be prepared to speak to them, the first thing they'd do, they'd dig in their pocket and bring out their wallet, and they'd be showing you their wife and children. And they really didn't want to be here. That's, to be quite fair to them, they didn't. But and basically the vast majority of them were fine. The people who were horrible were these Organisation, because they were the people who effectively were the people who were controlling the slaves. Gestapo weren't very good, though we had very few Gestapo over here, but if you fell in their hands over anything, life was a bit horrible, to be quite truthful. But I kept clear of that, thank goodness. But you know, they wouldn't think anything at all if somebody was, if one of their slave labour people. I mean, one day when we were still living at St Albans, it would have been about 1942, I think, we heard a great kerfuffle at about 8 o'clock in the morning. And we went from the kitchen into the lounge and looked out the window to see what was happening, and there was a whole pile, but it seemed to be hundreds of people who had been walked or put in cattle trucks on rail and brought right across Europe, you know. And there was women carrying children and all amongst them, and they were being, the people, it was Organisation were taking them out to, you know where the Kenway is now.
Mm-hmm.
The Kenway now at that time didn't have any houses on it at all, and they were being put in huts there, and they were being marched from there to wherever they were wanted to work. But they'd been marched and put in cattle trucks right across Europe. And really speaking, there was, for example, one bloke we saw who broke ranks because he thought he saw the butt of a fag in the gutter. He dived for it, but he never got anything because one of these Organisation blokes just hit him across his back with his rifle, you know, and he wasn't being easy with it. It was just as hard as he could go, sort of thing.
And did you see this yourself?
Yes, I did.
And
so,
he died?
I haven't got a clue. I think he was grabbed by two of his own people who pulled him along.
And
know.
What did they use the slaves for? Why were
Everything.
they here?
I mean, all the. I mean, you see that wall. You see that railing along there.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the bottom of it, it's concrete. Well, as a kiddie, because Dad's shop was just up the road there, I used to come round here, and all that was put up by German slave labour under the Organisation, and it round here, if we played around here, you could see the way they treated them, you know, which was pretty bad. But there was nothing here. This was just like a field, except it was like sand dunes. All around here, it was sand dunes because there wasn't a wall there in those days. The wall finished up there somewhere, you know.